Okay, so extract from the Prelude, which is one of the longest poems in your anthology. We'll start just by looking at why this poem's been put in the cluster for power and conflict, because it doesn't immediately jump out as being one of those poems that central premise is power and conflict. The power and conflict explored in this poem aren't necessarily like the conflict that you see in your war poems and the conflict that you see in some of the other poems internally with what the narrators are grappling with. In this poem, it is very much about the power of nature and the power of nature in comparison to man. And the conflict comes from the inner conflict of the speaker in the poem. The poem's really showing the progress of that individual speaker moving from being very immature and childish towards a realization at the end that power comes through nature and that nature is so much more powerful than man. So you have got this progress and it's shown through the inner conflict of the speaker and his experience on the lake in the middle of the night. So if you remember, the extract from the Prelude is all about this journey into the middle of the lake on a rowing boat, and the character, our speaker, quite blithely and quite confidently rows out into the middle of the lake, and at a particular point in the poem realizes that they're actually terrified of what is in front of them, the sort of sheer vastness, the power of nature, the power of the mountain in front of them, and then decide to turn back in fear. And there's this sort of realization by the end of the poem of how much he had underestimated perhaps the power of nature and the power of other entities than himself. So I see it very much as almost like a progress of maturity and an almost sort of coming of age in the poem. I'll start with the title and its significance. It's really important that this is an extract from the Prelude. So it's an extract from a much bigger, what was intended to be an epic poem by Wordsworth. I'll take you through the poem line by line with some of the things that I think are most interesting or significant as we go. So we start with a very familiar and very comfortable setting, one summer evening, and that appears from the outset as though this is going to be a very kind of gentle and quite pleasant journey that we are going on. Led by her, we all are seeing straight away, this is almost like a little aside in brackets, a little addition. Her, we are assuming, refers to Mother Nature. So we've got from the very first line, the first sentence, this idea of nature leading the way. And when you reflect on that, having read the poem, the idea of nature leading somebody, again, we've already got the power of nature at the start of the poem. So he goes on to say, I found a little boat tied to a willow tree. To me, that image of the willow tree in the poem is so significant because a willow tree to me makes me think immediately of a weeping willow and that idea of grief and sorrow that's attached to that image. Within a rocky cove, he says he found that boat. Again, there's just something striking about some of the adjectives in the poem. So it's a rocky cove, there is something kind of not quite smooth and comfortable about it all. Which is this boat's usual home. He says its usual home. Straight I unloosed her chain and stepping in pushed from the shore. Some of these words at the starts of lines almost symbolize that he feels himself to be very, very powerful. He's the one that is performing these verbs. He is unloosing her chain, releasing this boat. He's stepping in and pushing her from the shore. All of these dynamic verbs are placing him in the position of power at the start of the poem. Our point is here that perhaps that is really naively placing himself in the position of power at the start of the poem. He acknowledges in the next line it was an act of stealth and a troubled pleasure. Troubled pleasure, it's oxymoronic there. Something that troubles you should not be pleasant, but we've maybe got a little bit of an allusion here to Jekyll and Hyde, or kind of a reference that you can spot in other texts that you have studied. Troubled pleasure immediately strikes us as something not quite being right here. He goes on, nor without the voice of mountain echoes did my boat move on. So everything around him is almost coming to life as he's rowing out into the centre of the lake. Leaving behind her still, he says, on either side, small circles glittering idly in the moon until they melted all into one track of sparkling light. A couple of things that always strike me about that little section: it's absolutely beautiful. We have got the small circles glittering, the moon, everything's melting. There is some really rich and really quite beautiful imagery there. There is a sound effect that is happening in this little section, glittering idly in the moon, sparkling light. And I would put it to you, although it might be slightly a far-fetched point, that that repetitive I sound is significant. The speaker in the poem is placing himself in the centre of everything he's doing at the very beginning. He's quite a selfish actor in the fact that he's stolen a boat and taken it out purely for his own troubled pleasure into the middle of the lake. So it is this almost, the sound is emphasising the self-centred nature of what he is doing. We go on to, but now, like one who rose, proud of his skill to reach a chosen point with an unswerving line. But now is almost a very change in tone and pace, very, very much changes it to become much quicker, the story that he's telling. Like one who rose, proud of his skill to reach a certain point. There is almost a sense here in the speaker in the poem of arrogance at that point. He's proud of what he's doing, even though he knows it's wrong, even though he knows there is a troubled pleasure behind it. And again, there's this sense he's indulging in something he knows he shouldn't, but he's being quite reckless and quite naive at this point. So proud of this skill to reach a chosen point with unswerving line. There's nothing going to throw him off course. I fixed my view upon the summit of a craggy ridge. So he just sounds as though he is absolutely sure of himself. He is very certain as he rows out into the middle of the lake. He goes to the horizon's utmost boundary. There is almost here a narrative of heroism. He's the hero in his own story that he is telling here. And he goes not just into the middle of the lake, he's aiming for the summit and the absolute kind of horizon's utmost boundary. He's going to go as far, he's going to push himself as far as he possibly can. He goes on to say far above was nothing but the stars and the grey sky. Again, placing himself alone in this context is him almost empowering himself, thinking that he's the most powerful component perhaps at that point. She was an elfin pinnace. He's talking about the mountain in the kind of distance. Lustily I dipped my oars into the silent lake. He is interrupting the silence and the calm of the lake. He is the one that is interrupting everything. And again, I think that word lustily is really important. There's something indulgent, there's something in terms of lustily that is selfish. There's also, you know, something reckless in the way that he is speaking there. Lustily, he wants this journey and he's going after it at the expense of destroying the silence and despite of everything else around him. And as I rose upon the stroke, my boat went heaving through the water like a swan. He is so proud. He's likening his own movements in the rowing to being like a swan, something majestic, something beautiful. When from behind that craggy steep till then the horizon's bound, a huge peak, black and huge, as if with voluntary power instinct upreared its head. I think it's at this point that we get a complete shift in tone in the poem. When, suddenly, from behind that craggy steep till then the horizon's bound, a huge peak, black and huge, he spots the mountain, and it is beyond comprehension to him. The reason we can tell that he is barely able to describe it is this repetition, and it is deliberate. An author can choose, particularly in a poem like this, to use a synonym for the word huge. It's being deliberately repeated to emphasise that he's lost for words. He doesn't have another word for this mountain because it has taken his words away, the sheer power of it. This point here is the moment at which we see the power shift. We've gone from him being very kind of much the hero in his own narration of his story. We've gone from him acting very selfishly and very arrogantly to a shift here, and nature starts to take hold, and the power of nature, as we know from our study so far, is far more powerful than the power of man. So it becomes violent in his choice of verbs and his sort of imagery. I struck and struck again. Look at that repetition again. It's sheer desperation. Huge and huge, struck and struck. Desperate, kind of rowing away from this mountain that has upreared its head and that he's absolutely terrified of. And growing still in stature, the grim shape towered up between me and the stars. It becomes like a child's nightmare sort of image there. The mountain is chasing after him. It is very much like a sort of fantastical story that he's playing out in his head. And again, we see the sort of the childish nature of the speaker in the poem. So it's towering between him and the stars, and still, for so it seemed with purpose of its own and measured motion, like a living thing, strode after me. Look at the personification. For this child, the mountain has come to life and is chasing him back across the lake. So there are questions here about why. Is it because on his conscience is playing the fact that he's stolen this boat and that he's tampered with something he really shouldn't have? But there is this whole idea that the mountain is chasing him and is so much more powerful than he is. With trembling oars I turned, and through the silent water stole my way back to the covert of the willow tree. A couple of things here. Trembling oars, okay, we have absolutely got in his choice of adjectives and verbs here. He's turning, he's stealing away. We've got fear evoked from that collection. Back to the covert of the willow tree. Remember, the willow tree's already been mentioned. Back to this symbol of grief and death. There in her mooring place I left my bark. That statement about the boat is so much less confident than when he's unloosing a chain and pushing her from the shore. Now he's just leaving her. He can't wait. He can't get away from there quickly enough. So he leaves his bark, his boat, and through the meadows homeward went. There is an attempt here at, again, some of this beautiful naturalistic imagery. But there is then following that some quite serious and quite composed imagery. He talks about going in a grave and serious mood. Now, grave there is potentially being used because of its double meaning. So we went in a grave as in quite a somber and sad and serious mood, but in a grave mood. And I think that word is really significant at that point. Grave obviously has connotations of burial and death. Does he feel like he has experienced a brush with death? Is it the moment at which he's realised his insignificance in terms of nature that is surrounding him? Has it made him realise that time is precious and that all of these experiences as part of his life are sort of bringing him closer towards that point? So there is a lot that we could do with that word grave. He's in a grave and serious mood. After I'd seen that spectacle for many days, it's replaying in his mind, in his brain. It's going over and over again because it has affected him so deeply. Think remains at this point, something playing and playing over in a speaker's brain because it has had such a massive emotional impact on them. My brain worked with a dim and undetermined sense of unknown modes of being. On my thoughts there hung a huge darkness. What was the last thing in the poem that was, there hung darkness. What was the last thing that was kind of dark? Here we've got this huge peak that was black and huge. So there is this darkness that's hanging over him like a cloud. Call it solitude or blank desertion. The idea of him realising the solitary nature of him in comparison to the power of nature, collective. No familiar shapes remain, no pleasant images of trees or sea or sky, no colours of green fields. That repetitive use of no, all of that naturalistic imagery has been lost, it has disappeared. What he does have that remains with him, huge and mighty forms that do not live like living men, moved slowly through the mind by day and were a trouble to my dreams. He is haunted at this point by what he has seen. It is going to live on through his dreams. Again, think about the texts you've studied where things have haunted characters in their dreams. Think Macbeth at this point. So we end the poem, if we look at the beginning and the end, on such a different note. We began with all of this kind of positive and beautiful imagery and him taking this risk and him being this hero in his own story and being really kind of quite arrogant about his actions. There is a change in the middle. There is this shift that's really evident in the middle where he realises that perhaps he is not the most powerful at play in this scenario. The conflict comes mainly at the end in the poem. The conflict is that inner conflict, coming to terms with the fact that he is not as powerful as he thought. And the reason that I see this almost as a sort of coming to maturity sort of story, he begins with quite an immature and naive attitude towards what he is doing. and he very quickly realizes the sort of gravitas and seriousness of what he's contending with, and realizes that he is no match for nature in the poem. So by the end, it is the trouble of his dreams. It's almost like he has had some sort of, and to use a fancy word here, but a sort of existential crisis. He's grappling here with kind of, you know, what he's seen and what he's feeling and how it's affecting him. So I think by the end of the poem, one of the most dramatic things is the change in his realization. So right at the end, we come to this idea of disillusionment, potentially to this idea of disempowerment. And disempowerment is a useful word for you to use here. What is more powerful in this poem is nature. So hopefully it's been helpful for me to talk you through the poem. I just wanted to finish with some of the poems that you could link this to and some of the other poems that you could use. So obviously you have got your straightforward choices in terms of the power of nature. You could certainly look at Ozymandias in terms of the power of nature over man. You could definitely as well look at time in this poem in comparison to Ozymandias and the development of sort of power and conflict and how that shifts across time. I think it's a brilliant poem to potentially compare to a change in an individual. So you could look at the powerful internal emotions as well in this poem and link it to things like checking out my history, the emigre, powerful internal emotions within remains and coming to terms with an experience. They are some of the other poems that I think link really well with this one. Good luck with your use of the Prelude. Hopefully this has been really helpful. Thanks.